Emily, a 28-year-old woman, arrived home after a long day at work. Her hands trembled slightly as she slid the key into the lock, a habit she had developed after hearing about the recent home invasions in the neighborhood. The news reports replayed in her mind, and every sound from the street made her nerves spike. As she turned the key, she felt resistance, a slight pressure, as if something on the other side. Her heart raced. She glanced around, checking if anyone was nearby, but the street was empty. She pushed harder, and finally, the door gave way. Inside, everything seemed untouched. The lights were off, just as she had left them, and the quiet of the house was broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. She quickly locked the door, double-checking it, then sighed in relief. Emily walked to the kitchen for a glass of water, her footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. As she drank, her phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number. "You forgot to lock the door last night." A chill ran down her spine. She rushed to check the door, but it was securely locked. She tried to calm herself, convincing herself it must be a prank, until she heard the faint sound of a footstep behind her. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Turning slowly, she saw nothing. The darkness of the house now felt suffocating. Grabbing a knife from the drawer, she moved cautiously, her hands trembling with fear. Each step toward the bedroom felt heavier. When she reached the door, she noticed a cold draft. The window was slightly open. She never left it like that. With the knife in hand, she approached cautiously, her breath quick and shaky. Suddenly, something fell behind her. Emily spun around, but the room was empty. Her phone buzzed again. "I'm inside." The air around her grew thick with dread. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift, to grow. She bolted toward the front door, frantically trying to unlock it, but the lock wouldn't budge. Panic set in as she tugged harder. Then, she saw it out of the corner of her eye. In the mirror by the door, she could see a man standing still, lurking in the dark corner of the living room. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just watched her. Emily's hand slipped from the doorknob as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Her phone buzzed one last time. "I told you, you forgot to lock the door last night." The night was thick and humid. Mrs. Martha, a woman in her early 70s, lived alone in an old house, tucked away behind a wild, overgrown garden. Solitude didn't bother her, it had become an old companion. But that night felt different. The silence was heavy, and the darkness seemed to press against the windows, as if something outside wanted to come in. Suddenly, the lights went out. Everything was plunged into darkness. With hands well versed in navigating her home, Mrs. Martha felt her way to the kitchen, finding a candle stored in an old drawer. After several attempts, she lit the candle, her trembling hands barely managing to hold the match steady. The small flame flickered, casting long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch across the room. But the light didn't chase away all the darkness. Some corners of the house remained untouched, unreachable. She settled into her worn armchair near the window, listening to the creaks of the old wooden house and the wind stirring the trees outside. But then she heard something else. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the yard. Mrs. Martha tightened her grip on the candle. Maybe it was just an animal, a stray cat perhaps. But the sound was heavy, unmistakably human. Her heart began to race as she peered through the window, the candlelight dancing weakly in her hands. There, near the gate, stood a figure. Tall, hunched, as if waiting. A chill crept down her spine. The footsteps resumed, this time circling the house. She heard the gate creak open, followed by the crunch of gravel underfoot. Whoever it was, they were coming closer. Fear gripped her chest, and she found herself struggling to breathe, her frail body no longer able to fight or flee. Determined to lock the door, she rose to her feet. But as she reached the front of the house, she realized it was too late. The doorknob was already turning, slowly. In a panic, she blew out the candle, hoping the darkness would hide her. But the intruder knew exactly where she was. The door creaked open, and Mrs. Martha shrank into the corner of the room, clutching the extinguished candle like a talisman. Her eyes slowly adjusted to the shadows, and then she saw him, a tall man, his face obscured by a grotesque mask. His eyes gleamed with a sickening hunger. "Who are you? What do you want?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't answer. He just moved toward her, his footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. He was closer now, close enough that she could smell the damp, rotting scent coming off him. He leaned in, staring into her eyes, so near that she could see her own reflection in the twisted mask. Then, he spoke for the first time, his voice low, rasping, and barely human.
You lit the candle and brought me back.
A cold realization washed over her. The candles she always used had once belonged to her grandmother, candles said to have been used in old rituals. She had never believed in such stories until now. The man, or whatever he was, straightened up suddenly and vanished into the shadows of the house. For a brief moment, silence returned, save for the wind outside. She thought he had left. With shaking hands, she lit the candle again. But as the flame flickered to life, she saw she was not alone. His reflection was beside her, not in the house, but within the flame itself. He was smiling, the grotesque mask twisting and moving like living flesh. Before she could react, the candle burst into a blinding light, and the final darkness swallowed her whole. When the neighbors found her house the next morning, the door was locked from the inside. Mrs. Martha was seated in her armchair, the candle extinguished in her lap, her eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. She would never be alone again. It was late at night when Julia got home, after another day at school. The house was eerily quiet, as if time itself had stopped inside. She always hated when her parents went out and left her alone in that big, old house, but she had gotten used to it. The familiar smell of aged wood and the constant creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet never bothered her until that night. As soon as she stepped inside, she felt that something was off. There was a tension in the air she couldn't explain. The wind howled outside, and the trees cast long, distorted shadows that danced across the walls. Julia dropped her backpack on the floor and headed to the kitchen. But when she opened the fridge, something caught her attention. Muffled voices coming from upstairs. She froze. Who's there? Her voice echoed through the house, but no answer came. With her heart racing, Julia grabbed a knife from the drawer and slowly climbed the stairs, each step creaking under her weight. As she approached the end of the hallway, the voices became clearer. A man and a woman were arguing, but she couldn't make out what they were saying. It was a frantic whisper, as if they were planning something terrible. She stopped in front of her parents' bedroom door. The voices were behind that door. Gripping the knife tightly in her trembling hands, she took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The voices, however, had stopped the moment she entered. Julia stepped back, confused, trying to calm her mind. I'm imagining things, she muttered to herself, closing the door. But as she turned to leave the hallway, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the mirror at the end of the hall, a shadow darted across a tall, thin figure that vanished the second she blinked. She bolted downstairs, panic rising in her chest. As she reached the bottom, she heard the front door open. Her heart pounded, the knife still in her hand. She hid behind the couch. She heard soft footsteps and the door closing with a quiet click. The conversation resumed, now clear and disturbingly calm. We need to deal with this. She's here, the woman's voice said, cold and distant. I know, the man replied, his voice heavy with exhaustion. They were inside the house. Julia could barely breathe. Who were these people? Were they here to kill her? Desperate, she crawled toward the kitchen, searching for an escape. The back door was just a few feet away, but before she could reach it, the man's voice came again, this time closer. She doesn't understand. She doesn't realize this is our house. Julia froze, her heart skipping a beat. Our house. She had lived there with her parents since she was a child. How could these strangers claim the house? Running to the basement, she locked the door behind her and stayed in the dark, trying to steady her breathing. That's when she saw something that made her heart stop. On the basement walls were old photographs. Pictures of the house, but much older than anything she had ever seen. And in the photos, the couple, the man and the woman who now walked the halls above her. They had been the owners of the house many years ago. She looked closer, and in the corner of one of the photos, she saw someone she recognized. It was her, Julia, with the same face, the same fearful expression. But that was impossible. Suddenly, everything clicked, and an unbearable chill swept over her. Julia wasn't alive. She never had been. She had died in that house, years ago, perhaps at the hands of the same couple who now haunted the corridors. And now, she was the intruder. The lights flickered, and the couple's voices echoed through the basement. "She doesn't remember," the woman said, her voice full of pity. "Not for long," the man replied, calmly. Julia fell to her knees, the knife slipping from her hand. Now, she remembered. The sound of footsteps coming down the stairs was the last thing she heard before everything went completely dark.